The moment that broke me didn't look dramatic from the outside. It looked small, casual, almost harmless. We were standing in the living room of our house, surrounded by people my wife called friends, the kind who laughed too loudly and judged quietly. Someone made a joke about my job, about how I was still figuring things out, and the room chuckled. I waited for my wife to shut it down, to say something, anything. Instead, she laughed too, the same laugh she used when she wanted to fit in. That sound stayed with me. Later that night, after everyone left, I asked her why she laughed. She shrugged and said, "It wasn't that serious." But it was. Because in that moment, I realized she didn't see me the way I thought she did. My name is Daniel Moore. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my marriage, I believed love meant endurance. That if you stayed quiet long enough, if you worked hard enough, respect would eventually follow. I was wrong. My wife, Claire, and I had been married for 8 years. On paper, we looked fine. No screaming fights, no obvious scandals. Just a slow erosion I didn't notice until it was too late. Claire worked in marketing for a luxury real estate firm. She loved status, appearances, being admired. I worked in logistics, managing supply chains for regional distributors. It paid well enough, but it wasn't impressive. And to Claire, impressive mattered. That night wasn't the first time she'd laughed at my expense. It was just the first time I saw it clearly. As the house grew quiet, I sat alone on the couch, replaying moments I'd brushed off, comments I'd swallowed. I didn't feel angry. I felt invisible. And that feeling scared me. Because once you realize the person beside you doesn't value you, you start questioning how long they've felt that way. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of the end, not just of my marriage, but of the version of myself that accepted being diminished. After that night, nothing changed on the surface, and that was the most unsettling part. Claire didn't apologize, didn't bring it up again. She acted as if laughter erased consequences. But something inside me had shifted, quietly, permanently. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing patterns I'd ignored before. How she corrected me in front of others. How she spoke over me, finished my sentences, decided things without asking. She'd say things like, "Daniel doesn't really care about that stuff," or "He's easy, he'll go along with it," and smile like it was affectionate. Each time, a small piece of me folded inward. One evening, we were getting ready for another gathering, this one with her coworkers. I told her I didn't feel like going. She paused, looked at me in the mirror, and said, "You can stay home if you want. It's not really your crowd anyway." Not angry, not cruel, just dismissive. I went anyway, because part of me still believed showing up mattered. At the restaurant, I watched her transform. Her voice changed, her posture straightened, her attention drifted away from me. I became background, a detail she didn't bother explaining anymore. At one point, someone asked how long we'd been married. 8 years, she said quickly, then added, "People change a lot in that time." She didn't look at me when she said it. Later, as we waited for the check, she leaned across the table and whispered, "You know, ambition is attractive. Stability gets boring." I nodded, even though my chest felt tight. That night, lying beside her in bed, staring at the ceiling, I understood something painful. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She simply didn't consider my feelings important enough to protect. And when someone stops protecting you, it's usually because they've already decided you're replaceable. The distance between us stopped feeling emotional and started feeling logistical. Conversations turned practical, schedules, groceries, obligations. Affection became rare, then optional. One afternoon, I came home early and found Claire on the phone in the kitchen. She laughed softly, the same laugh, lower, warmer, meant for someone specific. When she noticed me, she turned away slightly and said, "I'll call you back." Not, "I love you." Not, "Talk later." Just, "I'll call you back." She ended the call and smiled. "Work?" she said quickly. I nodded, because nodding had become my safest response. A few days later, she mentioned a colleague named Mark. She spoke his name casually, but often, always followed by admiration. "Mark thinks differently," she said once. "Mark isn't afraid to take risks," she said another time. I listened, pretending not to hear the comparison forming. Then came the night she didn't come home on time. No message, no explanation. When she finally walked in, she said, "Dinner ran late," and went straight to the shower. Her phone buzzed while she was gone. I didn't touch it, but the name lit up the screen. Mark. I sat there, Still, realizing something worse than betrayal. She hadn't tried to hide it well, which meant she didn't think she needed to. The next morning, she was calm, cheerful even. She kissed my cheek and said, "You seem quiet lately." I almost laughed at the irony. That was the moment I understood. She wasn't just drifting away. She was slowly rewriting the story of our marriage, and I was no longer the main character. And once someone starts rewriting you out of their life, they've already chosen how it ends. I stopped asking questions after that. Not because I didn't care, because I was afraid of the answers. Claire began staying later at work. She'd come home energized, distracted, glowing in a way she hadn't around me in years. When I tried to talk about us, she'd sigh and say, "Why do you always make things heavy?" As if distance was lighter than honesty. One night, I suggested counseling. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I don't think therapy can fix a lack of ambition. Not anger, not cruelty, just certainty." I slept on the couch more often after that. It felt easier than lying beside someone who'd already checked out. In the quiet, I began remembering who I was before shrinking became a habit. Then came the invitation. A formal event hosted by her firm, clients, executives, investors. She handed me the card and said, "Please don't embarrass me." She laughed afterward, like it was a joke, but jokes don't usually land that deep. At the event, she barely acknowledged me. Introduced herself first, then added, "This is Daniel," without context. When Mark arrived, she brightened immediately. They stood too close, spoke too comfortably, and when he shook my hand, his grip lingered, confident. Someone asked if Mark and Claire worked closely. She smiled and said, "He understands where I'm going." I stood there, realizing she hadn't included me in that future. On the drive home, she didn't turn on the radio. She stared out the window and said, "I can't keep pretending we're aligned." No apology, no anger, just finality. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed a bag, not to leave, but to remind myself I still could. Because the most dangerous moment isn't when someone betrays you. It's when they convince you staying small is your only option. I didn't leave that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, bag packed, realizing something uncomfortable. I was still hoping she'd stop me. Claire didn't notice the bag. She was already asleep, turned away, peaceful in a way that felt undeserved. That was when I understood. She wasn't waiting for me to fight for us. She was waiting for me to disappear. The next morning, she spoke gently, like you do to someone you've already made up your mind about. "Maybe some space would be good," she said. "Not for us, just for you." I moved into the guest room. Weeks passed with polite distance, shared calendars, quiet dinners. She treated me like a roommate who overstayed his welcome. One evening, she came home late again. She didn't explain, didn't offer details. Instead, she said, "I met someone who reminds me who I used to be." She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. I asked her directly if she was seeing Mark. She paused, then said, "I didn't plan it. It just happened." That sentence landed heavier than any confession. I expected anger, maybe tears. Instead, I felt relief, because uncertainty is heavier than truth. She told me she needed more admiration, more momentum, more life. She said I was safe, dependable, kind, like those were flaws. When I told her I was done, she looked surprised. She'd assumed I'd wait, adjust, shrink further. I packed the bag properly this time. As I reached the door, she said, "You'll regret this." I didn't turn around, because walking away wasn't weakness. It was the first decision I'd made for myself in years. Living alone felt strange at first, quieter than I expected, but lighter too. No tension in the air, no careful phrasing, no need to read someone else's mood. Claire texted a few times that first week. Practical messages, bills, schedules, reminders, nothing emotional. It confirmed what I already knew. She had moved on before I ever left. I threw myself into work, not as an escape, but as structure. Mornings had purpose again, evenings belonged to me. One afternoon, a coworker asked how married life was treating me. I hesitated, then said, "I'm not married anymore." The words felt solid, real, like reclaiming space in my own chest. A month later, I saw Claire and Mark together for the first time. They were laughing, leaning into each other, synchronized. It stung, but not the way I expected. What hurt wasn't losing her. It was realizing how small I'd allowed myself to become to keep her comfortable. She noticed me too. Our eyes met briefly, and she looked away first. That surprised me. The divorce papers arrived quietly, without drama. She'd already filled them out. Signed, dated, efficient, just like she'd become. As I signed my name, I felt something settle. The marriage had ended long before this moment. This was just the paperwork catching up. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. Who am I when I'm not trying to be enough for someone else? I didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find it. The rebuilding didn't start with confidence. It started with discipline. Simple routines, early mornings, clean spaces, small promises I could keep. I stopped explaining myself to people. When someone asked what happened, I said, we grew in different directions, and left it there. Silence felt stronger than justification. Work noticed the change before I did. I spoke up more, took ownership, stopped deferring. Projects moved faster when I trusted my judgment, and people responded to that certainty. One evening, after a long day, I realized I hadn't thought about Claire at all. Not with anger, not with sadness, just absence. That surprised me more than pain ever had. A few weeks later, I ran into an old friend for coffee. He said, "You seem different," like it was a compliment and a question. I told him the truth. I stopped trying to earn approval. He nodded and said something that stayed with me. People don't leave because you're not enough. They leave because they're chasing something else. That night, alone in my apartment, I looked around and felt something unfamiliar, pride. Not loud, not flashy, quiet and earned. I didn't know where my life was going yet, but I knew where it wasn't, shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. And that was enough to keep moving forward. The real test didn't come from being alone. It came from being seen again. Friends started inviting me out. Coworkers included me more. And for the first time, I noticed how differently people treated me when I stopped apologizing for existing. One evening, at a small work gathering, someone asked if I'd ever been married. I said yes, calmly, without bitterness. Another person asked what happened, and I answered honestly. I stayed too long where I wasn't valued. No one laughed. No one pitied me. They nodded, like they understood. That reaction stayed with me. For years, I believed my marriage failed because I wasn't impressive enough. Now I saw something clearer. It failed because I'd confused patience with self-erasure. Around that time, Claire reached out again. Not to reconcile, not to apologize, just curiosity disguised as concern. "How are you doing?" she asked. I stared at the message longer than necessary, then replied, "I'm doing well." Nothing more. She didn't respond immediately. Hours later, she wrote, "That's good to hear." The conversation ended there, and so did whatever invisible hold she thought she still had. I began investing more in myself, not dramatically, not to prove anything, just deliberately. Better routines, clearer goals, firmer boundaries. I said no more often, and meant it. One night, as I walked home, I realized something quietly powerful. I no longer needed validation from the person who once diminished me. And when you reach that point, when their opinion loses its weight, you stop carrying a burden you didn't realize was crushing you. That was the moment my past finally loosened its grip, and my future stopped feeling like an apology. The shift became noticeable to others before I acknowledged it myself. People stopped interrupting me mid-sentence, stopped explaining things I already understood, and I realized confidence isn't announced, it's felt. Around that time, Mark's name surfaced again, not from Claire, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned he'd been promoted quickly, loudly celebrated, and quietly overwhelmed. It didn't bring satisfaction, it brought clarity. I remembered how Claire admired momentum more than meaning, how she chased forward motion without asking where it led. I had done the opposite. I stayed still, hoping loyalty would be enough. One afternoon, I received an email from Claire regarding a remaining joint account. Professional, brief, emotionless. At the bottom, she added a line that felt unnecessary. "I hope you're finding what you need." I paused before replying, then wrote, "I already have," and closed the laptop. That evening, I reorganized my apartment. Not because it needed it, but because I wanted the space to reflect intention, not survival. Each object I kept had a reason. Each discarded item felt like permission to move on. Later, lying in bed, I thought about how humiliation works. It doesn't scream, it settles. It teaches you to doubt your presence, to minimize your voice, to confuse tolerance with love. But healing works differently. It grows quietly, reinforced by choice, strengthened by boundaries, until one day you realize you're no longer bracing for impact. I didn't hate Claire. I didn't wish her regret. I simply no longer carried her expectations as my burden. And in that release, I felt something rare. Not victory, not revenge. Freedom, steady and unremarkable, and finally mine. Time did what confrontation never could. It created distance without drama. Months passed, seasons changed, and my life kept moving forward without asking for permission. I stopped measuring progress in milestones and started noticing subtler changes. I slept better. I laughed more easily. Silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. At work, I was offered a leadership role I hadn't pursued before. Not because I demanded it, but because people trusted my steadiness. During the meeting, someone said, "You don't rush decisions, but you don't avoid them either." I carried that sentence with me longer than I expected. One evening, while grocery shopping, I ran into Claire unexpectedly. She looked different, not worse, just unsettled. We exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. When she asked how I was doing, her voice carried uncertainty. I answered honestly, "I'm at peace." She nodded slowly, like she was processing something she hadn't anticipated. For the first time, she looked at me without judgment, without comparison, just curiosity. We stood there for a moment too long. Then she said, "I'm glad you're okay." It sounded sincere, but also final. As I walked away, I felt no urge to look back. That surprised me more than anything else. Later that night, I reflected on how power shifts quietly. Not through arguments, not through explanations, but through the simple act of no longer needing someone to see your worth. Humiliation had once reduced me to silence. But silence, used differently, had rebuilt me. I wasn't louder. I wasn't richer. I wasn't trying to win. I was simply whole again. And that, I finally understood, was the point all along. Wholeness changed how I listened to people. I no longer waited for approval in their reactions. I listened for meaning instead. Around that time, a new colleague joined our department. Her presence was calm, observant, unassuming. She didn't perform confidence. She carried it quietly. We worked together on a project that required patience more than speed. She noticed details others rushed past. I appreciated that immediately. Our conversations stayed professional at first, grounded in work and shared problem solving. One evening, after a long meeting, we walked out together. She asked about my weekend plans. I said I didn't have many. I was learning how to enjoy unstructured time. She smiled and said, "That's harder than it sounds." We started having coffee occasionally. Nothing suggestive, nothing rushed. Just two people talking without subtext, without expectation. At some point, she asked about my marriage. I told her the truth, without embellishment. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it. She just listened. When I finished, she said, "It sounds like you lost yourself for a while." I nodded. She added, "I'm glad you found your way back." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it flattered me, because it recognized effort, not outcome. I realized then how different respect feels when it isn't conditional, when it doesn't depend on ambition, speed, or appearances. I wasn't ready for anything new yet. But for the first time, I wasn't closed either. And that space between readiness and openness felt honest. A place where something real could eventually grow. Openness didn't arrive as excitement. It arrived as calm. I noticed it in small moments. Conversations that didn't drain me. Silence that didn't need filling. The colleague's name was Hannah. We began working more closely, not by choice, but because our styles aligned naturally. She asked thoughtful questions, listened fully, and never tried to dominate a room. That alone felt unfamiliar in the best way. One afternoon, during a break, she asked why I never talked about my achievements. I laughed and said, "I spent years explaining myself to the wrong person." She nodded, like she understood without needing details. We started walking together after work sometimes. Nothing romantic, just shared space and conversation. There was no pressure to impress, no need to perform, and that absence felt like relief. One evening, she said something that surprised me. "You know, people don't lose ambition when they slow down. They just stop chasing validation." I didn't answer right away because it felt uncomfortably accurate. At home, I thought about Claire. Not with longing, not with bitterness, but with distance. I could finally see our marriage clearly, how love had become a transaction, and silence had become survival. I realized something then. I hadn't failed by staying too long. I failed only when I stopped listening to myself. That awareness didn't hurt. It steadied me. Later that night, Hannah texted to ask if I wanted to grab coffee over the weekend. I stared at the message longer than necessary, not out of fear, but respect for my own pace. I replied, I'd like that. Simple, honest, unforced. As I set my phone down, I felt no rush, no expectation. Just curiosity, grounded and calm. And for the first time since my marriage ended, the future didn't feel like something I had to defend. The coffee with Hannah didn't feel like a beginning, and that mattered. It felt like a continuation of honesty, of calm, of not needing to be more than I was. We met at a quiet place near the river. No music loud enough to perform over, no crowd to impress. She arrived on time, smiled easily, and asked how my week had been. Not what I'd accomplished, not where I was going, just how I was. Conversation flowed without effort. We talked about work, about books we'd abandoned halfway, about the strange relief of choosing peace over excitement. At one point, she said, I used to think intensity meant connection. I nodded. So did I. I replied. There was no flirting, no testing of boundaries. Just two people paying attention. When we stood to leave, she hesitated, then said, I'm glad we didn't rush this. That sentence landed softly, but firmly. Walking home, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid of being hurt again. I was afraid of returning to who I'd been when I accepted being diminished. That night, Claire crossed my mind briefly. Not as comparison, not as regret, just as contrast. I understood now that humiliation doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from indifference, from being tolerated instead of chosen. I'd confused stability with safety, silence with maturity. But love doesn't require you to disappear. As I lay in bed, I felt something settle into place. Not excitement, not certainty, alignment. For the first time, I wasn't trying to prove I deserved love. I was simply allowing it the space to exist. And that, quietly, changed everything. Alignment didn't make life perfect, it made it honest. I noticed it in how I spoke, how I moved, how I no longer edited myself to be palatable. Hannah and I didn't define anything right away. We let time do its quiet work. Coffee became walks, walks became dinners, not scheduled, not strategic, just natural. One evening, while sitting across from her, she asked a simple question. What did your marriage teach you? I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, that love without respect turns into endurance, and endurance isn't the same as commitment. She nodded, thoughtful, not alarmed. She shared her own story, a past relationship where ambition masked insecurity, where being admired mattered more than being known. Listening to her, I felt something rare, understanding without comparison. That night, I realized how different this felt from before. No hierarchy, no silent scorekeeping, no sense of being evaluated. A few days later, I received an email from Claire's lawyer about a final document. Routine, impersonal. I signed it without hesitation, without emotion. That surprised me more than anger ever had. Afterward, I sat quietly and acknowledged something important. Closure isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with explanations or apologies. It arrives when the past no longer demands your attention. Later, Hannah asked how my day had been. I told her the truth. She didn't celebrate, didn't console. She simply said, I'm glad you're free. That word stayed with me, free. Freedom wasn't about being single or attached. It was about no longer negotiating my worth. As I walked home that night, the city lights felt softer. Not because life had slowed, because I was no longer bracing against it. And for the first time in years, peace felt sustainable, not temporary. Sustainability became my quiet measure of success. Not excitement spikes, not dramatic turns, just consistency I didn't have to recover from. Hannah and I never announced what we were doing. We didn't need labels to validate what felt balanced. Time with her didn't drain me, it clarified me. One evening, while cooking together, she laughed at something small I said. Not politely, not performatively, genuinely. The sound caught me off guard, because it wasn't approval, it was presence. Later, she asked if I ever missed my old life. I thought about it carefully before answering. I miss who I thought I had to be, I said, but not who I actually was. She nodded, like she understood without needing explanation. That night, I dreamed about the house Claire and I once shared. In the dream, it was empty, quiet, intact. No anger, no damage. When I woke up, I felt nothing. That absence of reaction felt like closure. Weeks passed. Work stabilized into something meaningful, not consuming. Friendships deepened without effort. I no longer felt behind. I felt aligned. One afternoon, Claire crossed my path again. Not in person, but in memory. I realized I couldn't recall the sound of her laugh clearly anymore. That startled me. Then it comforted me. I understood then that healing doesn't erase the past. It just stops giving it authority over the present. Hannah noticed the change before I spoke it aloud. "You seem settled," she said one evening. I smiled and replied. I finally stopped asking permission to exist. She reached for my hand, not urgently, not possessively, just there. And in that quiet connection, I knew I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was simply living, fully, without shrinking. The shift became visible to others before I acknowledged it myself. People stopped asking if I was okay. They started asking how I did it. At work, my opinions carried weight now. Not because I spoke louder, but because I no longer second-guessed myself. I noticed it during meetings. I spoke once, clearly, and silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence, listening silence. One colleague pulled me aside and said, "You seem different." I asked what he meant. He said, "You don't look like someone waiting to be approved anymore." That stayed with me all day. That evening, Hannah and I walked through the city without destination. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement. The air felt calm, unhurried. She asked what I wanted next, not what I planned, but what I wanted. The question felt unfamiliar. No one had asked it that way before. I realized most of my past decisions were reactions, not choices. I reacted to expectations, to pressure, to fear of falling behind. Now, there was space between impulse and action. Space felt powerful. We stopped near a bookstore. Inside, I picked up a journal, nothing expensive, nothing impressive. At home, I wrote one sentence on the first page, slowly. I no longer negotiate my worth. The act felt ceremonial, like closing a chapter without resentment. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I didn't open it immediately. That pause mattered more than the message itself. For the first time, curiosity didn't outweigh peace. When I finally checked, it was nothing urgent, nothing meaningful. I smiled, set the phone down, and went to bed content. Because strength, I learned, isn't confrontation. It's knowing what deserves your attention and what no longer does. The message I didn't reply to didn't disappear. It waited. Days passed, then a week. Silence became an answer of its own. When the name finally appeared on my screen, Claire, it didn't shock me. What surprised me was how little my body reacted. No tight chest, no racing thoughts, just stillness. Her message was careful, rehearsed. She said she'd been thinking a lot, said she missed us, said she hoped I was well. No apology yet, just soft words testing the ground. I read it once, then again, noticing what wasn't there. No ownership, no accountability, only nostalgia wrapped as concern. That pattern felt familiar now, painfully transparent. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I went about my evening, cooked dinner, washed dishes, lived. That choice felt deliberate. It mattered. Later, I typed a response, then erased it. I typed another, erased that too. Finally, I wrote only one sentence, calm and final. "I hope you're well, but I've moved on." No punctuation beyond the period, no opening for debate. Her reply came fast, faster than mine had. She said she didn't mean to reopen wounds, said she just wanted closure. I almost smiled. Closure is rarely about the other person. I didn't respond again. Because closure doesn't come from explanations, it comes from boundaries. The next morning felt lighter. Not victorious, not dramatic, just clean. Like air after a storm. At work, I finished a project I'd delayed for months. Momentum builds when resistance ends. I felt it clearly now. That evening, Hannah noticed the change without asking questions. She squeezed my hand and said, "You seem settled." I nodded, because that word finally fit. Settled didn't mean finished. It meant rooted, no longer swayed by echoes of the past. Weeks moved forward without ceremony. Life rarely announces progress. Claire didn't reach out again, and that silence told me everything words never could. Some people don't fight for closure. They wait for regret to soften you first. I no longer played that role. What surprised me most was how my confidence returned in quiet ways. Not loud wins or dramatic moments, just small decisions made without fear. Saying no when I meant no. Choosing rest without guilt. Speaking without shrinking. At work, my manager pulled me aside one afternoon. He said he'd noticed the change, my focus, my initiative. Then he offered me a leadership role overseeing a regional team, something I would have hesitated to accept before. This time, I didn't. I said yes without asking myself if I deserved it. I already knew I did. The first meeting was uncomfortable. Old instincts whispered that I should stay quiet, avoid attention. I ignored them. Discomfort is often the cost of growth. Hannah noticed the shift too. One night, while we cooked together, she asked, "What changed?" I thought about it carefully, then answered honestly. I stopped asking permission to exist. She didn't laugh. She nodded like she understood. There was no rush between us, no need to define anything prematurely. We moved slowly, intentionally, building something without pressure. That steadiness felt foreign and safe. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching city lights flicker on, she said something that stayed with me. "You don't carry resentment. You carry clarity." I'd never heard it put that way before. She was right. I wasn't angry at Claire anymore. Anger requires attachment. What I felt now was distance, clean and firm. That distance gave me room to become someone new. Not better than anyone, just better aligned with myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to my life. I was choosing it. Change didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in habits. Mornings became quieter, intentional. I woke up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted the head start. Coffee tasted better when it wasn't rushed. Silence felt like ownership. I stopped explaining my choices to people who hadn't earned that access. Not out of arrogance, out of self-respect. Some doors don't need to be reopened just to prove you can close them again. A mutual acquaintance mentioned Claire one afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just gossip wrapped in concern. "She seems unsettled," they said, like it was news. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no bitterness, just confirmation. People expect pain to linger forever. They don't talk enough about relief, the quiet relief that follows clarity. Work became challenging in new ways. Leading people meant being seen, questioned, relied upon. Old doubts tried resurfacing. I didn't let them stay. When decisions had to be made, I made them. When mistakes happened, I owned them. Confidence isn't never failing. It's refusing to disappear after you do. Hannah and I grew closer without naming it. There were moments of warmth, moments of pause. Nothing forced, nothing hidden. One night she asked, "If Claire came back, what would you do?" The question wasn't jealous. It was curious. I answered without hesitation. I wouldn't reopen a door I had to bleed to close. She smiled softly, not relieved, but reassured. Trust grows when answers come without delay. Later that week, I passed the old house. The lights were on, different car in the driveway. It felt like looking at a previous lifetime. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept driving forward, exactly where I belonged. Healing doesn't announce itself. One day you simply realize you no longer recognize the person who once accepted less. Success has a strange side effect. It makes people rewrite history. Old contacts started reaching out again. Casual messages, polite curiosity, questions that weren't really questions. "How did you manage that? You always had potential, you know." They didn't remember the silence. They didn't remember the jokes, the dismissive smiles, the way worth was measured only when it benefited them. I replied when I felt like it. I ignored messages when I didn't. Power isn't loud, it's selective. Claire reached out 2 months later. Not a call, a message. Short, careful, rehearsed. "I heard you're doing well." That was it. No apology, no accountability, no acknowledgement of what she'd taken. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I missed her, because I finally understood her limits. She didn't want reconciliation. She wanted reassurance, proof she hadn't misjudged her choices. I didn't reply. Silence is an answer when words would only reopen old negotiations. Hannah noticed my mood shift that evening. She didn't pry. She never did. She just sat beside me, present, steady. "You don't owe anyone explanations," she said quietly. That sentence landed heavier than she knew. Because for years, I'd lived as if I did. Weeks passed. Momentum built. I was invited into rooms where decisions mattered, where voices weren't raised, only respected. And something unexpected happened. People listened. Not because I demanded it, because I no longer needed to. One night, standing on the balcony, city lights below, I realized something simple and irreversible. I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was building forward. And the man Claire once laughed at wouldn't recognize the man standing there now. Calm, grounded, unshaken. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt final. Closure doesn't arrive with speeches. It arrives quietly. It was a random Thursday when I ran into Claire again. Not planned, not dramatic. A grocery store aisle, fluorescent lights, carts squeaking. She looked different. Not worse, not better, just smaller. She hesitated before saying my name. Daniel. I turned slowly. There was no rush anymore. We exchanged polite words, surface-level updates. Jobs, weather, meaningless safe territory. She kept glancing at my hand, like she expected to see something missing. You seem confident, she said finally. Not admiring, unsettled. I am, I replied. Silence stretched. Then she tried again. I didn't think things would turn out this way. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was revealing. They turned out exactly the way they were always going to, I said calmly. She swallowed. I never meant to hurt you. That sentence once would have mattered. Now it felt outdated, expired. Intent doesn't erase impact. And apologies don't work when accountability never follows. I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't reopen the past. I hope you find what you're looking for, I said. And for the first time, I meant it without attachment. As I walked away, something lifted. Not anger, not pride, just finality. That night, Hannah asked how I felt. Free. I answered without thinking. Freedom isn't about winning. It's about no longer needing the other person to lose. I slept deeply that night. No dreams, no rewinding moments. Some chapters don't need endings. They end the moment you stop rereading them. Life didn't slow down after closure. It sharpened. Decisions became cleaner. Time felt deliberate. I stopped measuring days by stress and started measuring them by progress. At work, responsibilities expanded. Projects I once supported were now mine to lead. People came to me for answers, not reassurance. Authority isn't claimed, it's recognized. And recognition arrives when consistency outlasts doubt. Hannah and I crossed an invisible line without ceremony. No dramatic confession, no labels forced too soon. Just presence turning into partnership. She noticed things others missed. How I paused before speaking. How silence didn't bother me anymore. You're different, she said once. Not hardened, just settled. That word stayed with me. Settled didn't mean stagnant. It meant anchored. One evening, while walking home, she asked quietly, "Do you ever miss who you were before all this?" I thought about it longer than expected. The version of me that tried to earn love through patience. The man who believed endurance was loyalty. No, I said finally. I understand him, but I don't miss him. She nodded, like she understood something deeper than the answer. Claire's name stopped carrying weight. Not because I forced it, because it naturally faded. Memories lose power when they aren't fed. I began planning long-term again. Not fantasies, foundations. Savings, travel, stability, growth. One night, standing in my apartment, I realized something subtle but permanent. I no longer feared being alone. And that meant I was finally ready to be with someone, not out of need, but choice. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and refuses to leave. Peace attracts attention, not the noisy kind, the curious kind. People started asking different questions. Not what do you do, but how do you think? Not admiration, respect. I noticed it in meetings, in conversations, even in silence. When I spoke, people waited. When I paused, no one rushed to fill the gap. Hannah and I became steady, not exciting in a cinematic way, but solid in the ways that last. She didn't compete with my past. She didn't need to. She met me where I was, not where I used to be. One evening, she told me something honest. I don't feel like I have to earn your attention. That sentence hit harder than any compliment. Because for years, I'd been taught love was something you performed for. I realized then how warped my understanding had been. I mistook tolerance for devotion. I mistook silence for loyalty. Work brought an unexpected opportunity. A senior role, more influence, more visibility. Old fears surfaced briefly, then disappeared. I accepted without hesitation. Not because I needed validation, because I trusted myself. That confidence didn't come from titles or money. It came from surviving something that tried to shrink me and choosing not to stay small. One afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Claire's name, one last time. I just wanted to say, I see you now. I stared at the message. Not angry, not tempted, just aware. Seeing me now didn't change what she chose then. And it didn't need to. I typed a single reply. I hope you learn to value people before you lose them. Then I blocked the number. Not out of spite. Out of closure. That night, I slept without interruption. No memories surfaced. No arguments replayed. Some endings don't hurt. They confirm you've already moved on. Time has a way of proving what words never could. It keeps going. Months passed without friction. No drama resurfaced. No ghosts knocked again. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. Hannah and I moved carefully, not out of fear, but intention. We talked about boundaries, about expectations, about what we would never tolerate again. One night she asked, "What scared you the most back then?" Not about Claire, about yourself. I answered truthfully, that I'd disappear trying to keep someone else comfortable. She nodded slowly. That won't happen here. And I believed her, not because she promised, but because her actions matched every word. I noticed how different love felt when it wasn't conditional. No tests, no silent punishments, no audience required. At work, stability turned into mastery. I mentored others who reminded me of my past self. I told them what no one told me. Patience is not the same as self-sacrifice. One evening, walking through the city, I caught my reflection in a window. Posture relaxed, eyes steady. A man who knew his place and chose it deliberately. I thought briefly about Claire. Not with resentment, not with longing. With clarity. She wasn't cruel. She was shallow. And shallow people drown in depth they don't understand. I didn't win because she lost. I won because I stopped playing a game that required me to be smaller to stay in it. Hannah squeezed my hand as we crossed the street. This feels right, she said. It did. Not exciting like chaos. Not intoxicating like uncertainty. Right like balance. Right like peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for something to break. I was building something meant to last. I used to believe strength meant holding on. Now I know it means letting go. Not everything broken needs fixing. Some things and so better things can begin. The version of me who stayed quiet to keep peace is gone. The man who confused tolerance for love doesn't live here anymore. I didn't rebuild my life to prove anything to Claire. I rebuilt it because I finally understood my own value. Hannah never tried to change me. She never asked me to shrink. She simply stood beside me, and that changed everything. One evening, sitting quietly, she said, "You don't flinch anymore." She was right. I didn't brace for impact. I didn't wait for disrespect dressed as humor. That's when I understood what healing really looks like. Not happiness every day, but dignity every day. Some people enter your life to test you. Others enter to meet the version of you that survived the test. Claire taught me who not to become. Hannah showed me who I already was. And the man I am now doesn't need validation, revenge, or closure conversations. He walks forward without looking back. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen, undervalued, or slowly erased by someone who should have protected you, know this. Your silence is not loyalty, and your patience is not weakness. You deserve respect without asking for it. This channel is new, and stories like this will keep coming, honest, raw, and real. If you want to be part of that journey, consider subscribing. It truly helps more than you know. Thank you for listening. Your story isn't over yet.